Hello, I am Enrique Quesada, and this is Mexico Centered, a podcast from the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. During the 2018 presidential campaign season and the transition period before taking office, López Obrador's strategy to address the issue of Central American migrants traveling through Mexico en route to the U.S.-Mexico border rested not on a security plan, but rather on a vision of human rights for migrants and of economic development in the region to make migration a choice, not a necessity. The recent Comprehensive Development Plan, launched jointly with the governments of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, show the Mexican administration's commitment to pursuing this vision. At the same time, the mounting pressure and escalating rhetoric of the Trump administration regarding the U.S.-Mexico border and Central American migrants has led the Mexican government to use the National Guard to prevent these migrants from entering Mexico. How has Mexico's strategy evolved as a result of increasing pressure from the United States government? Will Mexico pursue both a security and a developmental strategy to address migration? To discuss this and other questions, I called Luis Arriola. Luis Arriola was the summer 2016 Mexico Center visiting scholar. Arriola is a researcher at the Migration Studies and Transborder Processes academic group at el Colegio de la Frontera Sur in Campeche. His research interests include diverse dimensions of human mobility as well as border studies. Arriola's work at the Center for the United States and Mexico focused on examining the impact of the comprehensive program for the southern border. Here's our conversation. Luis Arriola, visiting scholar at the Center for the United States and Mexico and researcher at the Migration Studies and Transborder Processes group of the Colegio de la Frontera Sur, thank you so much for accepting the invitation to be on the podcast.
Oh, my pleasure, Enrique.
So, last August, you authored a research paper for the Baker Institute titled López Obrador's Initial Policies Towards Central American Migrants, Implications for the U.S. And so I wanted to talk with you about what these policies are, how they may have evolved, and what this means for the relationship between the United States and Mexico. And so to set up the stage, can you tell us what was López Obrador's original plan for dealing with the migration situation before we saw the recent migrant caravans from Central America starting in late 2018, and how was his intended approach different from what previous administrations had done?
Yeah, a blueprint of Mr. López's government program, which came out in 2017, that is when he was running for president, envisioned the fostering of safe transfer convoys in charge of civil groups, society groups, groups that will move migrants from the southern border to the northern border of Mexico. This idea may seem odd today, especially after the emergence of the Caravans, but I guess it made sense to the team that drafted such proposition for Mr. López back then. Most importantly, in the national guidelines document I am referring to, there was an explicit intention to set up formal agreements with Central American nations to hire workers in Mexico as a way, to curtail the migration of people further into Mexico and towards the U.S.-Mexico border. These will be temporary employment schemes. Now, there is no indication on the part of the government, so the Mexican government so far, that these intended policies will materialize in the near future. When Mr. López delivered his 100 days in office report on March 11 of this year, the president made two claims concerning the question you are raising. First, there will be no use of force to contain migration coming from Central America. Second, Mr. López pledged to invest no less than $2.5 billion in neighboring countries and $4.8 billion in southern Mexico to foster initiatives aimed at boosting the economy in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and states such as Chiapas, Tabasco, Campeche, and Yucatan. The intent is to create development areas that will make out-migration a voluntary option, not something that that people will be forced to do because of poverty or insecurity conditions and concerns. One might argue that Mr. López only partially kept his promise about not using physical force to deter Central American migrants entering Mexico and to try to get to the U.S. The evidence in support of this criticism are developments that took place in early June of this year when the recently created National Guard was deployed at Mexico's southern border region as a way to support Mexico's National Migration Agency, INM, in its efforts to stop the forming of new caravans and overall halt the flow of migrants heading north. Even though at the time Maximiliano Reyes, the Undersecretary for Latin America and the Caribbean within the Secretariat of Foreign Affairs, declared that the National Guard will not engage in the actual detention of migrants, the mere presence of the militia-like forces have sent echoes of de facto militarization at the border. Now, this scenario has to be understood in the context of mounting pressure from the U.S. government on Mexico at the time. As you may remember, Enrique, Mr. Trump threatened with imposing tariffs on Mexican goods if nothing was done about stopping Central American migrant flows. And Mexico's government had to comply reluctantly by sending the National Guard per one of the requests from the U.S. During the negotiations held at the time in order to back down on the tariff threat. This way of pressuring Mexico worked because the number of incoming migrants lessened thereafter. Now, Mr. López made good on his second claim because in June the president announced support for a reforestation program in El Salvador as part of a larger initiative called the Comprehensive Development Plan for El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Southern Mexico. Basically, the reforestation program is meant to create jobs that in turn will discourage people from immigrating. That's the premise behind it, right? $30 million were offered to Salvadorian President Nayib Bukele during his official visit to Chiapas on June 20th of this year. In late July, Mr. López made a similar proposal to the president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernández, pledging $21 million for reforestation plus another $9 million targeted to create jobs in that Central American nation. According to Mexico's Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Marcelo Ebrard, Planting Life, the name of the reforestation program, will benefit 20,000 people in El Salvador and 30,000 in Honduras. During a late September visit to Mexico, Guatemala's president-elect Alejandro Giammattei also learned that his government will get $30 million to implement Planting Life in his country. Finally, the main pending issue is whether these goodwill actions on the part of Mr. López and his government will work or not. Do the reforestation program will generate enough interest among the intended beneficiaries to make them stay put instead of migrating? What mechanisms of accountability will be set in place to make sure that the monies are used for the purposes they are meant? We need to keep in mind these and other questions in order to monitor the progression of Mr. López's initiative.
Right. So you mentioned that this is kind of the difference in López Obrador's policy or view of the issue, which kind of wants to focus on the human rights and development aspect of solving the issue of migration. And you mentioned this comprehensive development plan, but at the same time, the pressures from the U.S. government have made it approach this or continue to approach this as a security issue, as perhaps previous administrations had done. So in talking about this comprehensive development plan, which you discuss here at the end, as you said, it's a joint plan of the governments of Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. But what's the role of the U.S. in this comprehensive development plan, or how does the approach of the U.S. kind of play a role here? You mentioned that there's kind of some agreement between the Trump administration via the Vice President Mike Pence, but if their focus is on security over, say, governance and prosperity, do we expect this plan to work, or is this kind of operating all on its own?
Well, so far, let's put it this way. I think that there is a verbal agreement and verbal commitment on the part of the U.S. government to support the comprehensive plan. But in my opinion, the Trump administration has paid lip service to the idea of the plan. Again, in December 2018, when the plan was first presented, the initial response from U.S. authorities was very much in favor of supporting the initiative. During the negotiations that both countries held to make effective a halt of incoming flows in June of this year, the U.S. mediators upheld the government's commitment to contribute monetary resources once more. Yet, and to the best of my knowledge, no disbursements have been made on the part of the U.S. And I think there are other factors that we need to consider. One of them is the following. I am uncertain as to how the upcoming presidential elections in the U.S. may weigh in on U.S. policy towards Mexico in connection to major issues such as the North American trade deal and the comprehensive plan you're referring to. I mean, they are major issues from a Mexican point of view, but maybe not so for the current U.S. administration. Mexico and Latin America, for that matter, seem to be down the list on Mr. Trump's priorities on his foreign affairs agenda. Containing migration is what matters to the present U.S. head of state, in a way that so far fits only its own interests. I really don't see thus far the political will to bring about real change, to address the root causes that drive many people to flee, to leave Central America today. Certainly not in the way the Mexican government is thinking to address this matter. Nothing indicates as yet that Mr. Trump is considering other means to modify the current state of affairs other than through a security-first approach. One example among many are his actions to further cut the number of refugees that are being accepted into the U.S. While President Obama held the refugee ceiling at 110,000 people in fiscal year 2017, when Mr. Trump took office, he lowered that figure to 50,000. At the start of the current fiscal year, and that is this month, the ceiling plummeted to 18,000.
In continuing talking about this comprehensive development plan, in the recommendations of the paper, you say that this plan has a more top-down scheme, whereas perhaps what is needed are more from the ground-up initiatives. And I was wondering if you had any examples of what these kinds of initiatives would be, and why would this approach would be more advantageous, let's say, over the top-down approach. Do they address different parts of the problem? And why is this a better strategy?
Yeah. What I mean is that instead of allocating money into government agencies or big companies, resources could be delivered to grassroots organizations, cooperatives, and similar groups that work at the local level. They can generate jobs and maybe services among their members to foster development projects, feed to local needs, in contrast to the usual design and planning that central government officials come up with, usually designed at a faraway national capital, and frequently with ideas that are unsuitable or non-viable for real life conditions. There are other schemes that have had some degree of success in many parts of Mexico that ought to be strengthened, in this case in southern Mexico, but that also can be tried out in Central America. I'm thinking of one specific example, the so-called 3-for-1 program. It works more or less like this. The federal government in Mexico matches each dollar amount that an organization, say a club of Mexicans already living in the U.S., sends to their place of origin with the aim of funding a social project or a production project. The state government and the municipal government also contribute on equal amounts on equal terms to this triplet. Similar models are already in place in Central America. Particularly, I can think of El Salvador. So the way I see it, it's a matter of seeing into what has worked best and then put money from the comprehensive plan into innovative ideas. Approaches from the ground up are more sensitive to local cultural norms, cheaper to implement, and ideally they make people equal partners and participants in different types of projects. That's why I think they will work best.
So, to conclude here, I wanted to try to bring these things together, and I wanted to ask you how has Mexico handling of this situation changed from the way that it first planned it? So it seems like there's two tracks, right? There's a track of the Comprehensive Development Plan, focusing on development, and then there's the other track of security, which seems to come from the U.S. government's pressure on Mexico. So what are we seeing now, and what do we expect to see in the future as we move along? Do we expect to see these two kind of approaches move parallel to each other, one supported basically by the U.S. government and the pressure that's putting on Mexico, and the other one on the perhaps actual policies that the Mexican government wants to implement?
Yeah, I think that there are two different tracks, as you just said, to the approaches concerning migration issues and migrants coming from Central America to the U.S. The Mr. López Obrador's administration is very set on implementing the comprehensive plan with or without the support of the U.S. government. In fact, there has been announcements from time to time that other European countries will jump in, so to speak, on this idea of the comprehensive plan. I do not see much variation from the hardline approach that the Trump administration has maintained over the last year. Yes, I'm talking about the last year because we happen to be at a time, 1 year away from the first major caravans that headed to the U.S.-Mexico border. Right. So more and more the burden of dealing with migrants heading to the U.S. Seems to be or to remain on the hands of the Mexico's government. About 2 weeks ago, another forming caravan was stopped on its tracks outside Tapachula in Chiapas. The majority of the participants were Africans. The National Institute of Migration, the National Guard, and police forces intervened to stop the caravan. There is also the example of the so-called Remain in Mexico policy that the U.S. government practically pushed into Mexico into accepting de facto safe third country arrangements. Thousands of people are waiting at border cities such as Ciudad Juárez, Tijuana, and others, waiting for a hearing before a U.S. immigration judge, who is paying for the lodging and other expenses these people incur into Mexican citizens through the taxes they pay to the government. And there is also growing unrest among these asylum seekers. You may have heard that on October 10th of this year, around 300 Central Americans, mostly Hondurans, blocked the international bridge that connects Matamoros with Brownsville to demand that the handling of their cases be expedited because they have been expecting for months for a resolution. So the outlook is not very positive. As mentioned in the paper, as long as a sort of discordant dialogue continues to permeate the differing approaches the U.S. and Mexico see as solutions to migration issues, little in the way of progress is to be expected from my perspective.
Luis Arriola, the visiting scholar at the Center for the United States and Mexico and researcher at the Migration Studies and Transborder Process Group of the Colegio de la Frontera Sur, thank you so much for answering these questions.
No, thank you. Thanks to you for having me.
That was Luis Arriola. That is it for this episode. Thank you for listening to Mexico Centered. Thanks to Lisa Wakata, our program manager, and to Tony Payan, the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. You can visit our website at bakerinstitute.org/Mexico, where you can find our latest publications. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and the host, and do not necessarily reflect those of the Center. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can email us at mexicocenter@rice.edu. We would love to hear from you. Mexico Centered is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can subscribe through your favorite podcast app to receive all of our new episodes directly on your phone. I am Enrique Quesada. I will see you next time.